Back in 1969, as a turbulent decade was winding down, the Stonewall Inn was a popular gathering place for New York City's LGBT community. At the time, being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender was considered obscene, illegal, even a mental illness. One night, police raided the bar and started arresting folks. Raids like these were nothing new, but this time the patrons had had enough, so they stood up and spoke out. The riots became protests. The protests became a movement. The movement ultimately became an integral part of America.
On June 28, 1969, in Greenwich Village, thousands of people took a stand against oppression by rioting in the streets, creating a critical turning point for the LGBTQ+ community and paving the path for the ongoing struggle to attain equal rights.
In the 1960s, being gay was considered a mental illness, and most of the open LGBT+ community were homeless because no one would employ them. Every state except Illinois had laws against homosexual sex, mostly directed at men. Some gay men were castrated against their will, and others were lobotomized. Treatments that doctors recommended were talk and shock therapy. There are also records of gay people being physically abused, the injuries many times inflicted by disapproving parents. In cities like New York, gay bars were one of the rare places of community for gay people. However, almost all of the gay bars at the time were run by the mafia and were routinely raided by the police, despite regular bribing of the police.
Before the Stonewall riots, there was only limited peaceful cries for equal rights. Most older members of the LGBT+ community were very closeted about their sexualities because they were taught that it was bad to be gay growing up, but that was not always the case with the younger gay people. Groups of gay teens would walk the streets holding hands and kissing, trying to shock the street bypassers. The LGBTQ+ movement was also heavily influenced by the equal rights movement for African Americans. On July 4th, 1965, there was a protest outside of Independence Hall demanding rights for the LGBTQ+ community, trying to follow a peaceful protest route that Martin Luther King Jr. had taken. Some early activist organizations, like the Mattachine Society and Daughters of Bilitis, tried their best to peacefully promote equal rights, but the LGBTQ+ movement could not get much press coverage or supporters.
There were people involved in, protesting the government about not having equal rights, and there were a handful of LGBT publications out in the 50s, and so there were things going on in the gay community prior to Stonewall, but Stonewall was the flashpoint.
Inspector Seymour Pine, a policeman who often led bar raids, orchestrated the Stonewall raid by sending in 4 undercover officers to gather information. They then met up with Pine and 3 other officers, called for backup, and went to the bar to announce the raid and demand entry. They planned to take all the alcohol in the jukeboxes and arrest the employees and the cross-dressers. Cross-dressers and employees were put in the back under arrest, and the remaining were in the front of the bar for review and possible release. Cross-dressers had to be arrested because there was a law that you must wear 3 clothing items that fit your gender. However, the released patrons congregated outside the bar instead of just walking away.
It was obvious by this point in the night that something was different. This was not the usual routine raid. The inn was extremely packed as it was late Friday night, people who were being arrested were not cooperating, and Pine could not communicate with the nearest precinct. The radio was not working well, and when he got a signal through, another voice on the radio said to dismiss the call. Someone in the crowd had found the frequency that the police were using and was rejecting Pine's calls for backup.
The mood was definitely rebellious and angry.
One person in women's clothing exited the bar and refused to get into a police car. After getting out of the car and being shoved in, they were slammed up against the car and shoved in once again, but in one last attempt to escape, they jumped out of the car and screamed, "Why don't you guys do something?" and riot ensued. People started throwing coins and shouting, "Let's pay them off," referencing the bribes the mafia had made to the police. Then they started throwing bottles, rocks, and bricks, and people ran through the streets spreading the news. The crowd surrounded cars, banging on them and slashing their tires.
Realizing they were horribly outnumbered, the police locked themselves in the bar, which just enraged the crowd more. They started to break down the door and shattered the windows. Cans, trash, and even the trash cans themselves were thrown as well. Other people tossed in makeshift Molotov cocktails. Even with a hose and fire extinguisher, the police could not put out the fire.
The crowd had now grown to as many as 2,000 people. Once the inevitable sirens were heard, the crowd scattered but did not desert the scene. The fire department and 30 more police officers arrived with paddy wagons and fire hoses. They attempted to complete the raid, but people still resisted. Not even the high-powered fire hoses could subdue them. The city's riot police, the Tactical Patrol Force, arrived and formed a phalanx, a tactic that was designed for the orderly grid of the Manhattan blocks and usually made all rioters yield. But the West Village had a chaotic street design and the locals knew the neighborhood, so they easily snuck up behind the police, effortlessly leading them on a wild goose chase. Several of the young rioters started to mock the police, locking arms, lifting their legs in a Broadway kick line, and singing. Eventually the police retreated. No one was killed during the riot, but there were serious injuries inflicted by and among the police.
As the Friday night riot came to a close, people started to realize the immensity of what had happened. Police officers were humiliated. Almost everyone in America who had a reason had rioted, but not the LGBT+ community. No one expected them to riot, and no one expected them to win. No other group had ever forced the police to retreat. The community had split into two different groups, older and younger gays. The older part of the community was shocked at the riots. They had long lived with the fact that they would lose their jobs and probably be institutionalized if they came out. On the other hand, the younger members were ecstatic. Overnight, they went from closeted, isolated people to becoming part of a public community. The riots proved that they were not alone, that there were people who felt exactly the same as they did. Craig Rodwell, a gay rights activist at the time, immediately started to publish leaflets entitled, "Get the Mafia and the Cops Out of Gay Bars," and had 5,000 copies printed by Saturday afternoon. The pamphlet called for people to act again, telling gay people to open their own bars and to boycott corrupt places such as the Stonewall. The Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis painted a message on the window of Stonewall Inn that read, "Help maintain peace and quiet conduct on the streets of the village."
As night fell the next day, the crowd gathered and grew from hundreds to thousands once again. The riots of the previous night reprised and became so escalated that the Tactical Patrol Force, the TPF, had to come in again and this time brought tear gas with them. After several hours, the TPF managed to secure the block of Christopher Street in front of Stonewall Inn. On Wednesday, the neighborhood's newspaper, The Village Voice, published a condescending report of the riots. Their own neighborhood's newspaper had belittled, mocked, and disrespected them. The community was angrier than ever, and another riot occurred, just as violent, but only lasting 1 hour.
I don't think there was any mainstream media at the time that covered that in any kind of positive way. I think it was all very, very negative, and that was just more fuel for LGBT people. It's kind of like you get to a point where just like enough is enough. So in a way, that very negative coverage actually made people even more angry and more willing to stand up.
A week later, on Saturday, July 6th, the Mattachine Society hosted a rally to commemorate the riots at the club.
I think it created the movement. The riots caused the activist movement. It became a movement with methods and actions trying to change things. Earlier organizations just tried to be a kind of place for isolated gays to go to and feel a sense of community.
3 Saturdays later, over 500 protesters met in Washington Square Park to celebrate June's activism with gay rights speeches. Crowds marched down Christopher Street in nonviolent protest. Groups like the Mattachine Action Committee, Pink Panthers, Gay Liberation Front, the Lavender Menace, Gay Activist Alliance, and Lesbian Liberation Front formed.
A group of people were just tired of getting pushed around. Things had changed a little bit in the city, and people were beginning to congregate. People were just pissed off and being abused. The sexual revolution was beginning.
In the following days, people started to organize, which was the first time that had happened. Groups started to form. The Gay Liberation Front started to form. The riot itself created an organization that created other organizations.
A year later, on June 28, 1970, Craig Rodwell and his team of organizers planned the Christopher Street Liberation Day March. Several hundred people started the march, but more joined as they paraded through Manhattan. No one attacked them, and police even offered words of encouragement. Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco also had pride marches that year. By the 10th anniversary of the riot, over 50,000 people were marching annually.
The Stonewall riots inspired young gay people in the 1960s and 70s and ignited the oncoming LGBT+ revolution. Shortly after the riots, more LGBT+ newspapers and organizations were founded. Within 2 years of the riots, gay rights groups were established in nearly every major city in the U.S. 4 years after the riots, being gay was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. In 1988, the LGBT acronym was officially established and started to be used nationally. In 2011, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed by President Obama. On June 26, 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex marriage was legal in every state. In June of 2016, President Barack Obama named the Stonewall Inn as the first LGBT+ national monument. In early January of 2017, the Boy Scouts of America announced that they would accept transgender boys.
The Stonewall riots were a key component in kickstarting the LGBT+ movement, inspiring people to fight for what they are entitled to as American citizens, equal rights.
Because everything came out of Stonewall. It's like the Gay Liberation Front came out of Stonewall. The Pride marches came out of Stonewall.
The LGBT+ community was mistreated for much of the 20th century, considered criminals and mentally ill, and were thought of as the primary cause of the spread of AIDS. One night, the anger from being victimized all these years overtook the patrons at the Stonewall Inn, causing them to take a stand and set alight the LGBT+ movement, marking a revolutionary turning point in history for the oppressed.